In this video, I'm going to deal with section 3, or part 3, section 2 of the introduction. So on pages bottom of 12, top of 13. It's perhaps useful to try and remember and keep in mind what the argumentative strategy of Laruelle is here. The introduction is a sort of overall presentation or anticipation of the argument of the book, or at least the grounds and bases for the arguments in the book. The section 3 is called From Philosophy to Theory, the Science of Ordinary Man. And what we've basically got is a set of criteria of demarcation between science, in particular the science of man or the science of humans, and philosophy and the human sciences that he doesn't really regard as sciences. So to repeat these criteria, theory, or the science of ordinary humans, is naive, real or absolute, that is to say, anhypothetical, theoretical, descriptive, and human. And the opposing side, if Laruelle can be said to deal in oppositions, the side he's demarcating out of is philosophy, which is reflexive, hypothetical, practical or technical, constructive, and anthropological. So we dealt with the first one last time. Science is naive rather than reflexive, which means it is non-circular. It's outside the circles that we get with the anthropological difference or identity, and it's non-thetic positionality. That's what Laruelle calls it. We can already have a sort of question there. If this is a criterion, non-circularity, is Laruelle as non-circular as he thinks? He's given the criteria, but we can use these criteria to judge Laruelle's own work globally and in the particular parts or pages or sentences that come up for examination. A second query that we may have, that will be coming up more particularly today, is criterion 2 is that the science of ordinary humans is real or absolute and not hypothetical. Yet criterion 3 that we'll be doing next time says that the science of ordinary men is theoretical rather than practical or technical. So we're going to get into a possible problem. How can it be both theoretical yet not hypothetical? So maybe we won't be able to see that treated to our satisfaction in section 2. Maybe we'll have to wait to section 3, or maybe we'll have to wait to the end of the book. We'll see. Another consideration to have in mind is that Laruelle, is he doing this for rhetorical reasons, or is he absolutely convinced of what his strategy is saying here, but this form of demarcation is a structuralist. He's setting out two structures, the structure of philosophy and of the human sciences, which is all based on known predicates and the calculation of known predicates, so of cliches, and its only way of creating novelty is by creating new combinations of old cliches. It can't go any further. And something else that he calls the science of ordinary man or ordinary humans, which is using what? New predicates or giving new senses to old predicates, because Laruelle is writing he's writing in French when he writes the book, and it's translated. There's no new unknown language that is being employed. So he's going to have to distinguish between the words that are being used and the typical predicates or the known predicates which are often attached to these words. So we must be prepared in these criteria to see a different sense to the words used than we might normally associate with these words. Another consideration which could explain his strategy for escaping from the cliches. The escape from the cliches is this escape from circularity and the circularity of cliches. And these are abstractions. They're universals, they're abstractions. And Laruelle's solution is not the sort of empiricist one of, oh yes, philosophy is full of abstractions, we'll just go down to earth to concrete experience. Because for Laruelle, concrete experience as ordinarily understood is totally constructed by philosophical operations. So the way out of abstraction, and this is something that we see in Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus, the way out of abstraction, in their case to the abstract machine, in Laruelle's case to the science of ordinary man, is become even more abstract. So Laruelle's strategy is what we can call abstractive ascent and not concrete descent. We can call it semantic ascent and not, at least not for the moment, semantic descent, whereas Deleuze's signature is very rapidly combining or moving or pulsating from one to the other, from incredibly high semantic ascent to incredibly specific semantic descent. Laruelle in this book is focusing on semantic ascent, and this makes sense of his warnings in the foreword that he's deliberately omitting all citations and all putatively idle discussions. Putatively idle discussions. And he specifies elsewhere that he's avoiding examples. We can ask, we can see the rationale for that sort of strategy, but we are entitled to ask, are we missing something? Are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Admittedly, not all, a lot of discussions are idle, and they just slow us down or embroil us in confusion because they're nothing to do with what we're saying. But some discussions could be fertile. So Laruelle up to now has been avoiding or refusing explicitly all principles. And then he seems to be working in terms of the principle of no discussion. Yet, at the same time, and I'm going back to the last paragraph of the foreword, he says, and he lists it under the flaws inherent in the enterprise, but he's sort of justifying the flaws. Naivety, that's nonetheless the virtue that he has just defended as a criterion of science in section 3.1, and a little later, successive refusals designed to cordon off a territory. So these successive refusals demarcate a territory. So instead of argument on the same level, he uses refusal as a springboard for his semantic ascent. So one can ask, because he considers that list of trays, he endorses it, that these are trays of his text. He lists them as flaws that I think we must understand in flaw in inverted commas, but they are something that as strategies, heuristic techniques that can come under consideration at one or another moment. So 3.2, giving the criterion of science that it's real or absolute rather than hypothetical, says it I suppose is the science of ordinary humans. It does not begin with the cogito, which has always been preceded by idealizing philosophical operations and has never been a real beginning, but with individuals as non-positional, transcendental experiences of themselves. So that's a mouthful. So the cogito is not a real beginning because it's been constructed by idealizing philosophical operations. It's not a first principle. Laruelle doesn't like principles anyhow, and it's not a first certainty. This is building on Nietzsche's and Hegel's critiques of the cogito as not being a first certainty at all, not being self-evident, but constructed by idealizing philosophical operations. So it's not a real beginning. So what is the beginning? What is the real beginning? And the real, in real beginning, has all the weight of Laruelle's parti pris for the real all through the text up to now. The real beginning is individuals as non-positional transcendental experiences of, in parentheses, themselves. So first I recall that we have the parentheses when the linguistic syntax doesn't correspond to the syntax of thought. So we're obliged, I would say especially in French, we're obliged to put in the of, but in thought, we should either relativize or omit that which is in parentheses. So why must we omit the of in thought? Because experiences of themselves, individuals as non-positional, transcendental experiences of themselves, we get to the objection that Laruelle has expressed already, that these experiences are not in the form of a subject experiencing an object. These transcendental experiences are pure subject, nothing but subject. He says that on page 8. The essence of man remains in the one that is in the inherence that is non-positional of itself. So I would say there that is self non-positional. So in English we can do it. We don't need the of. In a nothing but subject or absolute as subject, that is a finitude. So supposing that English gives us a little more leeway than French, we could say that the real beginning is individuals as non-positional, transcendental self-experiences. So self-experiences is still ambiguous in English because there could be this idea of taking the self, whatever that is, as an experience, or there could be as the object of an experience, or there could be the hyphen as being a hyphen of identity. So probably the best solution, even in English, unfortunately, is to keep the form there and keep the of and put it in parentheses. So that way we have a visible reminder that there's a dissonance between what we read and what we think. This is to say that finite individuality is likewise not a principle. So he did envisage on page 10, at the beginning of the last paragraph, the idea of a humanity principle. So and he's saying the same thing. The humanity principle is just sort of speaking loosely. It's not a principle. This is not, strictly speaking, a humanity principle whose statue we would try to erect beside or beyond the power principle, the language principle, the pleasure principle. So there's no principle of humanity. The only principle, well, he considers that maybe we should think of it as a principle, but that's not strictly speaking the truth. It's in the other paradigm, that is to say, the science of ordinary man, and so it can't have the logical status of a principle. That would make it logos in the anthropological difference, and so it would make it automatically within the whole configuration of Greco-unitary thought. So the principle that he cites before then is, on page 11, what he calls the principle of the sciences, which we will not specifically discuss here, but which is itself based in the one, is the principle of real immanence or identity, a principle unknown to philosophy, but which holds for the empirical and transcendental sciences. So if we're sensitive to the whole argumentative thrust against principles and their logical status, this is speaking loosely. He doesn't qualify it here because he's already qualified it on page 10 just before, that it's not, strictly speaking, a principle of humanity. So given that humanity is real immanence or real identity, it's not a principle of real immanence or identity either. Anyhow, page 12, we're back again, confirming our hypothesis. This is to say that finite individuality is likewise not a principle. So if it were a principle, this is the sense of the rest of the sentence, it will be in the anthropological difference. It will be always primary according to the ratio ascendi, the ratio cognoscendi, or the unity of difference between the two. So the ratio ascendi is the logical order of being, and the ratio cognoscendi is the logical order of knowledge and ultimately of logos. So finite individuality is a beginning, but it's not a principle. It's a real beginning. And so it's not a principle which is not real, as we shall see. Principles only, aside from the fatal flaw of the circularity induced by the anthropological difference, principles, well, that's the same thing in other words, are in the structure of circularity that characterizes philosophy. These are refined forms of the circle, and not yet the finite transcendental identity that is the essence of the real. So the ratio ascendi and the ratio cognoscendi is now considering this second criterion as a way of taking the section just before, 3.1, requiring naivete rather than reflexivity, and so outside circularity, and even this idea of a principle that would regulate the ratio ascendi and the ratio cognoscendi separately or together, even in this refined form, it's still a circle, and not yet the finite transcendental identity that is the essence of the real. Okay, so he's putting a lot on this notion of circularity as a criterion of, at least descriptively, and he calls it an essence as well, of philosophy, and non-circularity as the essence of the science of humans. So that does bring up the problem. I mean, he's just describing the two different paradigms. But how do we get to non-circularity? And how do we know we're inside non-circularity? can't really be inside it because there's no circle to make us an inside territory. So how do we know that our thought is characterizable by non-circularity? I'll finish the sentence and maybe I'll be able to come back to that problem. So there are the two ratios, are refined forms of the circle and not yet the finite transcendental identity that is the essence of the real, and that is no longer a condensation of the relative absolute, logico-transcendental circle of philosophy, thought and the real, being and thinking as the same, etc. So, what's important is the differences and difference create a circle, generate a circle, or coincide with a circle. And so difference is the circle, identity is real identity. Each time he has to put the adjective real in because he's taking it a word that designates a logico-anthropological predicate, and he's giving it a new sense. So identity without precaution may be contaminated by these cliches, these known predicates, these philosophical operations. So he has to put real in front of it to once again get us to think beyond the word. So the parentheses are a technique for showing us that the linguistic syntax doesn't correspond to the conceptual syntax. The real is an operator most of the time when it's before a noun in Laruelle. The real is an indicator that the semantics of the word do not correspond, that the ordinary semantics or that the traditional philosophical semantics of the word identity do not coincide with the scientific semantics that Laruelle is proposing, propounding, expounding. So that's the function of this repeated use of real. Such a radically finite transcendental identity exists. So we're in danger of being in a circle because he's doing a whole set of back and forth jumps between the different keywords of his vocabulary. So it's in danger of resembling the philosophical strategy of opening up a possible world and just wandering within the coherence of the system. And here he cuts the circle, or he tries to cut it, by saying it's not just possible, this other position, such a radically finite transcendental identity exists. So it exists, it's not just possible, it's real. Man in his non-anthropological experience. Once again, he's putting a lot of weight on experience, which he distinguishes from the empirical. The empirical is philosophically constructed, even in its avatars within the human sciences, the social sciences, the sciences of man. So it could be, this is a jump, that he's using experience in an almost Germanic sense of erfahren, that experience in the empirical sense is just what is given in empirically, and then we get all the whole set of Greco-unitary sophistication to show that the given is not given but constructed. And there's another added, so it's sort of called given because it's passive, even if this passivity is constructed. And there's erfahren, it's the experience that runs through Hegel's phenomenology, for example. It's the trial and error on the model of science. So it is experience, but it's the experience of trial and error, and so it's not just passive. So it's subjecting the experience to the testability that is one of the criteria of science. This testability is not just experimental, because experiments are constructed, but it can't totally refuse all experimental tests, but the experiments have to be analyzed. And this testability can be conceptual. And I would argue that one of the experiences, a non-anthropological experience, is discussion, dialogue. Is, if we want a different word from discussion, we can say is the bad thing. It's the exchange of cliches and stereotypes, and of that which can be constructed by means of cliches and stereotypes. So it just stays in a series, at best, a series of concentric circles, at worst just within one circle. And dialogue is seeing how a theory and its relation to experience looks from the point of view of another theory which deals with the same or similar or overlapping fields of experience, and may have advantages over and above what seems to be perfectly adequate theory in relation to its experience, when the theory and experience are just viewed by themselves. So dialogue is not just sort of sitting around talking and discussing. Dialogue is intrinsic to the scientific method, insofar as we could call it a method. I think we would have to say that it's a method without principles. That will be one of the implications of Laruelle's refusal of the logical status of principles. So there could be a lot going on within this, for the moment, not fully worked out concept of experience. And some of the working out might go against some of the other things that Laruelle has said up to now. This identity So the radically finite transcendental identity, or man in his non-anthropological experience, this identity is neither logico-formal nor logico-real. It is nothing but real, and not at all logical, in the sense in which logos is always a circular relation to the real. So this identity, a radically finite transcendental identity, is not a principle. It doesn't have the logical status of a principle. It's not logico-formal, and it doesn't have the logical status of something that is well confirmed by confrontation with the real, insofar as that confrontation is philosophically or logically organized. So it's neither logico-formal, not a principle in the logical or formal sense, nor logico-real. It's not a principle in the sense of the universal quantifier, we could almost say of inductive experience. There's no inductive principle that can get us to a set of inductive confirmations that can get us to this transcendental identity. It's not logico-real, it's nothing but real. So the actual scope of the nothing but real, we can put it, the other time we had the nothing but prefix was on page 8, when we had real man is subject, nothing but subject. And then at the very bottom, in a nothing but subject or absolute as subject. So the nothing but could be said to be sort of a via negativa way of characterizing absolute. So not just absolute, but the absolute. So the synonym of a nothing but subject is an absolute as subject. So the synonym of nothing but real would be an absolute as real and not a logico-real. Absolute being one of the names for that which is outside the logical and empirical constructions of the anthropological difference. Here again, a science of people is completely different from our philosophy. Philosophy is the science of real possibility, and the science of humans is a science of reality before the possible. So, what is the difference? What are the criteria of the difference between the two? Real possibility, that's for philosophy, because philosophy is a science of real possibility, and reality before the possible, that's for the science of ordinary humans, and which is the science of reality before the possible. Here we're at the level of an assertion for the moment. There's a decree going on. Laruelle, just in this sentence, Laruelle is building up progressively the whole network of conceptual interconnections, and he's building up his arguments. So it's premature to say either that this distinction is unsupported or even that it's supported. It has yet to be given enough determinate content to say much about, except that it is in coherence with all the rest. But if the notion of coherence is what we're going on for the moment, we've got to ask the question, to what extent is Laruelle involved in a form of circularity? It is possible, why not, that he's outside philosophical circularity, but he may be inducing a different sort of circularity. And if circularity is the criterion of philosophy, he may be within philosophical circularity, at least in these declarations. It takes time to build a new paradigm. It takes time to expunge all the vestiges of the old paradigm. So it's totally possible, plausible, likely even, that in a book that escapes from philosophical circularity, there may be some formulations in some contexts within the book that are more subsumable under the philosophical circularity than under the non-philosophical unilaterality. So for the moment, we know what he's pointing out, but we don't fully know the proof of this declaration. So the science of people, the science of humans, is a transcendental logic. No, philosophy is a transcendental logic and not a transcendental reality. The transcendental logic is philosophy. The transcendental reality is the science of people. And he goes on to add, to explain philosophy's choice or option of transcendental logic. It is a transcendental logic for fear of transcendental realism, which is essentially an absurdity. And so, to spell out what that means, it confuses the real with either logos or with the other of logos. So, transcendental realism is an absurdity, and he's not giving us any examples, true to his method of semantic ascent. And so philosophy, to avoid this absurdity, confuses the real with either logos or with the other of logos, which he's been saying over and over again in the first two sections of the first two parts of the introduction. Philosophical magic denies the authentic real in the name of a fantastic image. So he's talking about philosophical magic, which magically disappears the real and leaves us with a fantastic image. Given that he qualifies magic with philosophical, we're entitled to ask, are there other types of magic? Is Laruelle, in fact, using a form of magic, either in endorsable sense or in a reprehensible sense? Is he using, to coin a phrase, real magic? There is something magic going on inside his declarations, and that might be philosophical magic, at least on one axis, and there is something magical going on in the whole book, because in that sense, magic is the leap. You can't get there logically. You can't get to the new paradigm by pure logic. So you need some form of incommensurable leap that one could call magic, but in that case it would be real magic and not philosophical magic. Philosophy is not and has never been an absolute science. So we're getting back to our conjecture that nothing but real and absolute are synonyms. Philosophy is not and has never been a real science, and nothing but real science. Philosophy is not and has never been an absolute science. So once you're in Laruelle's absolute, there's no relative. The absolute is the absolute. And philosophy is only a relative absolute science, in inverted commas, with an irreducible hypothetical moment. So this idea of hypothetical moment is the opposite of his breaking of the circle at the beginning of 2, when he says when he says that these individuals as non-transcendental experiences of themselves exist near the end of the first paragraph. Such a radically finite transcendental identity exists. So we've got the hypothetical moment. Philosophy, in that sense, is sort of an incredibly long, 2,500 years long series of thought experiments, and that's the hypothetical aspect. We're always within thought experiments and not in real experiences. So any absolute we come up with in philosophy, it's a thought experiment version of the absolute. And so it has its own relative defined intra-system as the difference between absolute and relative. But if you're stepping outside or leaping outside the system, this absolute is itself only relative to the relative. So it's a relative absolute. In his own way, Nietzsche offers the key to philosophy. The real is an interpretation. This may or may not be a good characterization of Nietzsche. As a first approximation, one would like to say what is said to be the real is an interpretation. That might be a more plausible way of characterizing Nietzsche's so-called key to philosophy. So we can leave Laruelle with his uncharitable reading of Nietzsche as it's not exactly the charitable reading. The charitable reading will be to say that Nietzsche is already doing non-philosophy. The uncharitable reading will be to say that Nietzsche is just doing the same old thing, philosophy, in his newest variant. Laruelle is giving a greater status to Nietzsche, because it's not just philosophy, it's also the key to philosophy. So Nietzsche would be, in, so to say, the final philosopher, not in the sense that there are no philosophers after Nietzsche, but that Nietzsche gives the game away. So he's on the very frontier between philosophy and something else, but he's backward looking rather than forward looking. This, that is to say, both the relative absolute hypothetical science of philosophy and Nietzsche's interpretative key, this is the absolute idealist mixture of the real hypothesis or the real interpretation that the absolute science of the real excludes, in order to move straight away onto this anhypothetical terrain that philosophy has always viewed as a promised land. So, in a sense, he's coming back to the accusation which he excluded as being an absurdity that no one in philosophy would want to entertain, but of transcendental realism. But he's saying that, in fact, Nietzsche is showing us that this transcendental realism is the key to philosophy. Philosophers may be paying explicit or implicit lip service to the idea of overcoming or avoiding transcendental realism, but philosophy, in this key that Nietzsche gives, and that Laruelle sort of overgives, is an absolute idealist mixture called the real hypothesis. So there's a feeling that somehow hypotheses are not enough, and the solution is to create this bizarre hybrid notion, the real hypothesis or the real interpretation. So a hypothesis that would be real, or because you can't avoid a hypothesis, but you want reality, so you invent the real hypothesis. You can't avoid interpretations, but you want them to get us to the real, so it's a real interpretation. And the absolute science of the real, once again we have an of in parentheses, I'll come back to that. The absolute science of the real excludes. That's what the absolute science of the real excludes, in order to move straight away onto this anhypothetical terrain that philosophy has always viewed as a promised land. So we're back to the move of of demarcation that Laruelle mentions near the beginning of the third paragraph of the foreword. Here on the second page of the foreword, page XIII, where he talks about this flaw of successive, which I claim should be in inverted commas, successive refusals designed to cordon off a territory. So he's refusing, or the absolute science of the real is refusing, or here excluding, the absolute idealist mixture of the real hypothesis or the real interpretation. That's the old terrain. Perhaps you can say the old continent, using one of his other images. And cordoning off the old terrain from the new, which is the anhypothetical terrain. The philosophy is always viewed as a promised land. So, back to the meaning of absolute science of the real. We're now used to this sort of formulation. It's an absolute science of the real, where the of is not introducing the real as the object of the absolute science as some sort of impersonal subject. The absolute science is real, is the real. So we can't have a real hypothesis or a real interpretation, but we can have a real science. And here we're still basically stuck in a never expanding set of demarcations, and we haven't got to anything over and beyond the demarcations that would ground them in some sort of way. Or if we have, it happens so fast that we can't really hold on to it for the moment. This very concept of an anhypothetical terrain, or as he formulates it on page 11 when he's listing the criteria, a science that is real or absolute rather than hypothetical. This is a very strange concept, and at the very least we can say it's easily conflatable with the idea of a real hypothesis. So Laruelle is setting up the claim that science, or at least the science of humans, does not proceed by hypothesis. Nonetheless, the whole book is constructed, well, almost the whole book, the body of the book is constructed on theorems. Theorems normally are deduced from axioms. Axioms, when we're trying to apply the axiomatic system to the real world, are normally considered to have the logical status of hypotheses. So we're entitled to ask Laruelle at this point, what is hypothetical about your thought based on theorems? Axioms, another name for axioms could be principles, although there are also principles of inference that go with the axioms. But axioms you could consider as first principles or principles. So how can you have theorems without first principles? And for the moment, Laruelle gives us two criteria in the foreword that he takes up every now and then in the body of the work. The two criteria for an axiomatico theorematic system to decide on whether they're a science, and according to this claim, and hypothetical, is greater rigor than philosophical systems. That in itself doesn't seem enough to get us outside of the systematic circle of axioms and theorems and inferences. And that would only get us as far as a coherence theory of the truth of the system. And the other criterion is diversely called humanity, human experience, or human affect. And it's not just a human, all too human affect. That's the sense of the third paragraph in the foreword. It's affect not separated from theoretical rigor. So, and that's what he's going to give us, human truth, and not this philosophical truth up in the air based on the game of logical possibilities, and perhaps of creating the ultimate meta system that can put all the systems in their place, and so would be true by virtue of its ultimate coherence. Laruelle's argument is that it can be, a philosophy can be as coherent as it wants, as it can be, but it can never attain absolute coherence. And to get to truth, you need to aim at, and so to begin from the beginning with, human truth. So human experience and not empirical experience, human truth and not coherentist truth, or truth as coherence, not totality, not ultimate coherence. So there is a filling out of what he could possibly mean by anhypothetical in terms of at least these criteria, and in terms of, that is to say, greater theoretical rigor and greater humanity. And maybe it's all that Laruelle can do. He's expounding the pure case, but maybe, so it's an absolute difference, an absolute demarcation, but maybe all that we can actually have is a set of degrees, greater rigor and greater humanity could be, beyond a certain point, sufficient enough to be different from the philosophical running in circles that we have known or have mainly known up to now.